also deny ourselves the fullness of joy. Our lives are richer and more beautiful when they include a full range of experiences and feelings. Rather than trying to force our lives into neat and tidy designs, we're able to take the natural messiness that is real and sew it together somehow into a pattern that makes sense. When I was in my early 30s, I had a bout of serious depression. My kids were little, a baby and a toddler, and I was mostly able to hold it together for them, but as soon as my husband got home, I would go to bed and hide from the world. I talked to my doctor. She prescribed an antidepressant, and about a week after starting on it, I began to have suicidal ideation. The kids were in daycare one day, and I went out to Great Falls National Park, and I can remember as clear as if it were yesterday, standing on the edge of the cliff, looking down at the Potomac, and thinking it would be so much easier to just step off. It took every ounce of inner strength I had to step back from that edge. Now, that's not an easy memory to call up. It's not an easy memory to share. It's one thing for me to preach in the abstract about how damaging the stigma against mental illness is in our country. It's another to confess my own history. But here's the thing. That piece of me, that experience of deep depression, helps me connect with and support people who come to me for pastoral care in the midst of their own struggles. That part of my story is an important part. It made me more compassionate and ultimately stronger. Not only that, but what brought me to that place, to the edge of that cliff, was the refusal to face feelings of loss and failure, anger and frustration. I was trying so hard to be the perfect mother for my kids. Peaceful and loving and cheerful and engaged, that there hadn't been space in my life to feel a whole bunch of feelings. Within the space of a single year, my parents divorced and sold my childhood home. I resigned from my first ministry job, turned down a second ministry opportunity to stay home with the kids, and had a hysterectomy. Then we moved from a place where I had both a strong and vibrant network of friends and a strong and vibrant professional network to a place where I literally knew no one outside of my family. So I had lots of feelings, but I couldn't allow myself to feel them because then I wouldn't be that perfect mom. So they poisoned me. They altered my brain chemistry so that I felt like I couldn't go on. Now, once I took the space I needed to process the many losses I'd experienced in that year, they became a part of my story and they added shading and depth. That year and a half was traumatic and it was hard, but it adds to the beauty of the whole that is me. I appreciate waking up ready to enjoy life so much more now that I don't take that tremendous gift for granted. The gray of depression, the raw purple of loss, they provide contrast to those clear gold bits of joy and gratitude and the soft rose of healing. Now, I bet some of you are thinking, well, that's all well and good, but for my sake, I prefer to avoid thinking about negative events. I think it's better to just stay positive. As my mother used to say, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. But that's where the connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm come in. When we refuse to feel something, it leaks. And it doesn't just poison our brain chemistry, it poisons our relationships. Tony Robbins identifies 8 common defense mechanisms, ways that we defend ourselves from negative feelings. They are denial, simply refusing to experience unpleasant or uncomfortable events or feelings. Repression, burying the memory of what happened in our subconscious. Displacement, lashing out at people who are close to us and so, in theory, safe to be cruel to. Projection, imagining our experience onto other people. Reaction, moving to the opposite pole of experience. For example, someone who's afraid of their own sexuality becomes an active homophobe. That's reaction. regression, resorting to childlike behavior, so when we go hide in our room and slam the door. Rationalization, which is the blame and shame game. And sublimation, which is channeling feelings into some other outlet, which can be positive when, we channel them into music or art, but it can also be counterproductive and even addictive. Now, if some of these sound familiar, some of these defense mechanisms sound familiar, don't beat yourself up. They're normal. And as Robbins puts it, in the short term, these mechanisms are adaptive. We don't dwell, we don't say or do something with potentially damaging ramifications. We keep ourselves in a better state. But in the long run, the effect is actually the opposite, as routine use of defense mechanisms can actually reduce the effectiveness of emotional processing. That is why it is key to become more cognizant of our personal tendencies. As we become aware of our preferred defense mechanisms, we gain control over when and how we use them. We also, hopefully, are able to add additional tools to our emotional toolkit. The goal always is to be more capable of accepting all of ourselves and all of life. So think about the suffering in the world. Think about injustice, racism, oppression, violence. I think we can track all of it to these defense mechanisms gone amok. Denial looks like people refusing to see race. Repression, think about the way we've sublimated the history of slavery and violence toward indigenous tribes. Displacement, domestic violence grows out of displacement. Projection causes stereotypes and conflict. Reaction, that reactivity has created this polarization in our political system. And regression, the resistance to adulting that keeps people from creating healthy and sustainable lives. Rationalization, blame, and shame, oh my gosh, that causes so much harm in our world. And sublimation in the form of addiction destroys lives and families. I know, sweetie. The microcosm work of facing and integrating our unpleasant and challenging experiences, then, is an essential first step that allows us to move into the wider world with more skill and grace. Doing the work of stitching our diverse parts together internally is a key part of figuring out how to stitch our diverse community together. So I want to shift gears now and focus on the way this same metaphor offers us insights into the way we enter into community and the way we build the beloved community. I'm fond of saying that people are messy and community is messy, by which I mean that we are all complicated and we are all flawed. We make mistakes, we hurt each other, we get offended sometimes, we step on toes and our toes get stepped on. When we conceptualize community as a patchwork quilt, we gain a framework for embracing the messiness. We are the cosmic fabric stash. All of our different colors and patterns exist for a reason, and we can choose to believe that a pattern of great beauty and goodness will emerge as we stitch ourselves together, as we learn and as we love. In 1989, attorney Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in a paper called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. Her paper changed the way we think about identity and is an analysis that grows out of 3 court cases filed by Black women under Title VII, the anti-discrimination statute. It turns out the court system was completely unprepared to understand and deal with multiple overlapping oppressions. In one of the cases she references, a group of Black women wanted to prove that they'd been discriminated against in the workplace because they'd all been fired. The court ruled that they had to prove either that all of the women had been discriminated against or that all of the Black people had been discriminated against. Right? So they couldn't have an identity as Black women. And the court said, the prospect of the creation of new classes of protected minorities governed only by the mathematical principles of permutation and combination clearly raises the prospect of opening the hackneyed Pandora's box. Now, on the surface, this view seems almost logical, but think about it. If a company hires and promotes black men and uses this to prove it doesn't discriminate on the basis of race, and also hires and promotes white women to prove it doesn't discriminate on the basis of sex, they can and did legally refuse to hire or promote black women. Crenshaw wrote, imagine a basement which contains all people who are disadvantaged on the basis of race, sex, class, sexual preference, age, and/or physical ability. These people are stacked, feet standing on shoulders, with those on the bottom being disadvantaged by the full array of factors, up to the very top, where the heads of all those disadvantaged by a singular factor brush up against the ceiling. Their ceiling is actually the floor above which only those who are not disadvantaged in any way reside. In efforts to correct some aspects of domination, those above the ceiling admit from the basement only those who can say that but for the ceiling, they too would be in the upper room. A hatch is developed through which those placed immediately below can crawl. Yet this hatch is generally available only to those who, due to the singularity of their burden and their otherwise privileged position related to those below, are in position to crawl on through. Basically, what we need to understand is that all people carry multiple identities. Some of our identities carry privilege, and some of our identities are disadvantaged. We can't interact with only one aspect of our identity or one another's identities. Rather, we carry them all into every conversation and interaction. Crenshaw proposes that the work of fighting discrimination would go more smoothly if we started by liberating those at the bottom of the pig pile. She writes, it's somewhat ironic that those concerned with alleviating the ills of racism and sexism should adopt such a top-down approach to discrimination. If their efforts instead began with addressing the needs and problems of those who are most disadvantaged, and with restructuring and remaking the world where necessary, then others who are singularly disadvantaged would also benefit. In addition, it seems that placing those who currently are marginalized in the center is the most effective way to resist efforts to compartmentalize experiences and undermine potential collective action. So going back to our metaphor of the quilt, what she's saying is that the good and beautiful pattern will appear sooner if we start by listening to those who carry multiple disadvantaged identities. Some of you will remember my colleague and friend, the Reverend Teresa Soto. Teresa is a disabled Latinx person who also identifies as queer and gender nonconforming. T is also brilliant and creative, and she has a heart as big as the world. And I pay very close attention to everything Teresa writes and says, because I want to live in a world where everyone can benefit from her prodigious gifts. If we do what it takes to make the world a place that welcomes and celebrates Teresa in all aspects of her identity, that work will benefit all disabled people, all people of color, all queer folk, and anyone who identifies as trans or non-binary. All of them will feel welcomed and celebrated, and that's the world we want, right? The world we envision looks like a crazy quilt made up of billions of little crazy quilts. Each of the little crazy quilts is a person who's embraced diversity in the microcosm of their emotional life. And the big crazy quilt is a world that's embraced diversity and intersectionality in the macrocosm of our cultural and racial lives. Now, I'm not much of a quilter, but I have the feeling that crazy quilts are harder to make than the simple geometric patterns, yes? In the chaos and in the connections and the seams, though, something real and true and essential is revealed. We're not perfect, life's not perfect, but somehow we fit. Somehow we matter. We're part of a larger design that's beyond our comprehension, a design that lives in the deep wishes of our hearts. So be it, and so may it be. I'd invite you now to